안녕하세요. 오늘은 비트와이즈의 최고 투자 책임자이자 비트코인 투자 전략을 총괄하고 있는 매트휴건의 지금 하락장에 대한 의견을 담고 있는 영상입니다. 비트와이즈는 미국 기반의 암호화폐 자산 관리 및 투자 솔루션 제공 회사인데요. 2024년 한 해 동안 총 자산이 400% 이상 성장하여 2024년 말 기준 약 50억 100억 달러 규모로 확대되었고, 회사의 고객 AUM이 100억 달러를 돌파하면서 미국뿐만 아니라 유럽 시장에도 성공적으로 진출하는 등 글로벌 투자자들에게 깊은 신뢰를 받고 있는 알짜 회사입니다. 이번 하락장에 대해서 그는 어떤 생각을 가지고 있는지 살펴보시죠.
You said that right now it's the best time ever for buying Bitcoin on a risk adjustment base, from a risk adjustment perspective. Can you tell us what you meant by that and why you think so?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to look at every investment from both the reward and from the risk perspective.
And if we go back to the very earliest days of Bitcoin, let's say when it was trading for $1, obviously you had a huge amount of potential reward, but you also had a huge amount of risk. You had technology risk because Bitcoin was brand new. You had trading risk because there weren't good places to trade. You had custody risk. You had regulatory risk, reputational risk, government risk that the US government could come out and ban Bitcoin. You were taking on all those risks. And when I look at Bitcoin today, I think all of those risks have been removed. We now have ETFs, which make it push button easy to buy crypto with the best custodians and best traders in the world. The technology is run almost perfectly for 15 years. It's very stable and secure. You now have adoption by institutional investors. And now the US government has even created a US strategic Bitcoin reserve, removing, from my perspective, the last existential risk that the government might step in and ban this asset. So I think the risks have been largely removed, and yet you still have really significant upside. And yet Bitcoin is only 10% of gold. So just to match gold, which I think is just a stopping point on its long-term journey, it has to 10x from here. So as I look at it from a risk-adjusted perspective, you have significantly de-risked Bitcoin at the same time that you still have significant upside. And so I think it's the best time in history to buy Bitcoin, actually.
영상을 찍는 오늘 비트코인과 나스닥이 폭포수처럼 흘러내리고 있는데요. 제가 운영하는 앤드류 채널에서는 2월달부터 미리 비트코인과 시장 하락에 무게를 두고 있었고, 많은 분들이 도움받아 가셨습니다. 저희 앤드류 트레이딩 팀은 지금도 하락에 무게를 두고 있고, 앤드류 팀 자체 개발 오토비프로 지표와 자세한 비트코인과 알트코인 대응 방법은 영상 하단 더보기란과 고정 댓글에 남겨두었습니다. 채널에 놀러 오셔서 좋은 인사이트 얻어가시기 바랍니다.
So I think from a short-term time frame perspective, crypto behaves like a risk asset. We've seen that historically. If you look over the last 10 years, on days where the S&P 500 is down 2%, crypto is on average down 2.6%. So not only not hedging the pullback in Bitcoin on the day you get this pullback, but actually doing worse. And we're seeing a little bit of that right now with the uncertainty around tariffs. Although I would note that Bitcoin hasn't gone back down to its previous all-time high of 72,000. And it's still hovering, I would say, within the pull of that $100,000 range. So I think it's doing okay. Long term, the reason I think we're going to see really significant decoupling in the year ahead is you have to think of crypto as being driven by two factors: speculation, which is that risk on, risk off sentiment, and then fundamentals, which is what's happening underneath the surface to Bitcoin. And from my perspective, the fundamentals are just so overwhelmingly strong that it's going to overcome whatever sort of macro hurdles we have. At a fundamental level, Bitcoin is producing 165,000 Bitcoin per year. That's the total net new production. And ETFs are buying 500,000 a year last year. Corporations bought 250,000. I think governments are going to be buying significantly. And so I just think the fundamentals are too strong to be held back over the long term by this macro uncertainty. So what we have now, from my perspective, is a short-term buying opportunity. We're seeing the market react to the tariffs, but Bitcoin isn't about tariffs. If anything, tariffs are good long-term for Bitcoin because it increases government interference with money.
So when it comes to 2025, do you think there is still a reason to be bullish, or you think we need to wait for the longer run?
No, I'm still bullish for 2025. I think the price is going to end 2025 closer to 200,000 than to 100,000, and certainly higher than we are today. I don't buy the tough talk from governments that they're going to let us fall into recession and go through a period of deep structural adjustment. I think governments always end up pushing the easy button. Even deficit-conscious governments end up pushing the easy button of cheaper monetary policy, lower interest rates, more aggressive quantitative easing. And I suspect if we do, in fact, encounter the sort of economic volatility that people are predicting, you're going to see states or the government step in, lower interest rates, print money, and that's going to send Bitcoin straight up. If you look at institutional investors, they control, let's call it $30 trillion in wealth, just US wealth managers, just one segment of the institutional market. I think they have to get to, 2-3% allocations to Bitcoin. That's buying hundreds of thousands of dollars of Bitcoin. There's just too much structural long-term demand that has to come into this market against a severely limited new supply. And that means that existing holders have to sell. And some are willing to sell here at 82,000. Some are willing to sell at 100,000. But I think the price is going to have to ratchet up significantly if this demand materializes in the way I suspect it will. And everything I do at Bitwise, from meeting with clients every week to speaking at conferences, suggests that institutional demand. Most of the wealth management in the US breaks down into a couple different buckets. You have independent RIAs, registered investment advisors, that are individuals that can do whatever you want. And then you have many wealth advisors who work for firms like Morgan Stanley or Wells Fargo or UBS, these large national account platforms. And they have restrictions on what ETFs and what products they let those advisors buy. ETFs have to be approved by the SEC, and then they have to be approved by those platforms before they'll allow advisors to buy them. And where we are in the Bitcoin ETF journey is most of those platforms haven't turned on yet. So it's still the case today. That's going to change, I feel very confident, over the next 3 months. I think you're going to start to see those spigots turn on. And that's part of the reason I'm so bullish on the demand question, right? We go back to last year again, we saw ETFs buy 500,000 Bitcoin with half of the market literally restricted from doing anything. And that will change this year, and we're going to see yet more inflows.
매트휴건은 비트와이즈의 총괄로서 다양한 투자 기관을 만나는데 우리가 잘 알고 있는 모건 스탠리, 웰스파고, UBS 같은 투자 회사들은 아직 실질적으로 고객 자금으로 비트코인을 본격적으로 구매하지 못하기 때문에 비트코인 ETF가 승인되었어도 큰 자금은 들어오지 못했다고 합니다. 그런 이유로 매트휴건은 아직 비트코인이 상승장 초기 정도 수준이라고 이야기하는데 그의 말이 맞을 수도 있습니다. 하지만 제 채널에 등장하는 전문가들은 대부분 비트코인을 좋게 이야기해야 하는 위치에 있는 사람들입니다. 고객 자금을 굴리고 있거나 회사 자금으로 비트코인을 구매한 사람들이 많기 때문이죠. 시장에는 정답지가 없습니다. 그럼에도 많은 투자자들은 리스크를 감수하고 돈을 벌기 위해 비트코인 시장에 뛰어드는 것이죠. 하지만 급등락하는 비트코인 시장에서 급등과 급락을 반복하는 차트를 보고도 개인 투자자들이 욕심과 공포를 떨쳐내고 평정심을 유지하며 내 자산이 우상향하도록 하는 것은 말처럼 쉽지 않으실 겁니다. 저 또한 전업 투자자 생활을 오래 했지만 항상 좋은 자리를 기다리고 인내해야 수익을 조금씩 낼 수 있었습니다. 그래서 저희 앤드류 트레이딩 팀에서는 어떻게 하면 일반 개인 투자자들도 투자 시장에서 수익을 낼 수 있을까? 구독자분들께 어떻게 하면 조금이라도 도움을 드릴 수 있을까? 고민하다가 구독자분들도 비트코인이 명확하게 상승 추세가 나왔을 때만 투자를 하실 수 있게 한다면 수익이 조금이라도 나지 않을까 하는 생각을 하게 되었는데요. 제가 전업 투자를 하면서도 개발자로 오래 일했기 때문에 저도 써볼 겸 유료 결제를 해서 결국 만들었습니다. 바로 비트코인이 정말 신뢰할 수 있는 상승 추세인지 횡보인지 하락인지 알 수 있게 도와주는 지표인데요. 지금 보고 계시는 건 비트코인 차트인데요. 제가 빨간색 네모박스로 표시해둔 곳을 보시면 주황색 61선과 파란색 121선이 교차하는 구간에서 추세가 변동되는 걸 보실 수 있습니다. 실제로 지금 비트코인은 최근에 61선과 121선이 데드크로스 하방 교차하면서 조정이 나오고 있는데요. 제가 운영 중인 앤드류 관점 채널에서는 보시다시피 2월 25일부터 줄곧 비트코인 하락 관점을 말씀드리고 리스크 관리에 대해서도 강조드렸고 많은 분들이 도움을 받으셨습니다. 물론 데드크로스가 난다고 해서 무조건 하락하거나 상승하는 것은 아닙니다. 저희 앤드류 트레이딩 팀에서 개발한 알파빗 지표는 약 8개의 고급 추세 기준과 트레이더들의 노하우를 담아 차트가 상승할 확률이 높을 때 신호가 나오도록 개발되었습니다. 그 결과 저희 전문 트레이딩 팀 또한 판단에 도움을 받을 정도로 만족할 만한 놀라운 성과를 보였습니다. 시중에 유료로 팔 수 있을 정도로 가치 있는 지표이지만 저희 앤드류 채널 영상을 시청해주시는 구독자분들께는 무료로 제공해드리기로 마음먹었습니다. 저 또한 몇 날 밤을 새워 테스트하며 어렵게 만든 지표이지만 구독자분들의 성원에 힘입어 저 또한 도움을 받고 있기 때문에 어렵게 공유드리기로 했습니다. 초보자분들부터 경력 오래된 트레이더분들까지 굉장히 큰 도움을 받을 수 있는 지표라 자부합니다. 신청 방법은 하단 더보기란과 고정 댓글에 나와 있으니 많은 신청 부탁드리고 이번 하락장에서 모두 잘 살아남으셔서 좋은 성적 내시길 바랍니다.
You know, we do a survey of these advisors every year, these wealth managers every year. We've done it for 7 years. And we ask them what prevents them. And the number one thing historically has been a lack of regulatory clarity. And the number two thing has been a lack of an ETF. And those have been removed, right? We now have an ETF. I would argue that we have regulatory clarity around Bitcoin. And I think the concerns about those are going down. I think what people are focused on now are questions like, how do you value Bitcoin? Am I too late? And is it too volatile for your portfolio? I would answer those two questions pretty simply. Bitcoin itself is very volatile, make no mistake about it. But when you add it to a portfolio at the amounts these advisors do, which is typically 1 or 2 or 3%, and you rebalance that portfolio, what history shows is it doesn't increase your portfolio volatility overall. I like to make the analogy to hot sauce. If I drank a bottle of hot sauce, that would be uncomfortable. But if I'm having a burrito or some tacos and I put a little hot sauce on it, it makes it taste better. And I think crypto is like that in a wealth advisor's portfolio. It's volatile itself, but it doesn't make the portfolio volatile if you use it in the right amounts. And then on the valuation perspective, you know, we'll get into it, but I think we're still very early in this journey. It's still the case that most financial advisors, most institutional investors own 0 Bitcoin. Until that's not true, we're by definition early, and there's huge upside ahead, and I think that's the case right now.